Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. And today a bit of a special review because this review has been a massive labour of love, I guess you could call it. It's also so big that I'm going to break it into two parts because I've got lots and lots to cover when talking about the Elekit TU-8200R here. Before I introduce the TU-8200R, I just want to thank a few people that have helped to make this review possible. First and foremost, I need to thank Tube Sound Audio, the distributor here in Australia that arranged via Elekit a demo unit for me at a reduced price so I could afford to buy it, build it and share the review with you here on the channel. Stephen from Tube Sound Audio has been incredibly helpful along the way and even offered for me to go and attend his amp camp. Now I didn't need that because I'm quite experienced at building these sorts of amps, but what amp camp is about is for those of you that are not familiar with building a do-it-yourself kit like the 8200R, you can go along and have somebody actually help you step by step to build the kit. So I think that's a fantastic service, and whilst I didn't need it, I do think it's a great idea for those that haven't built amps like this before. I'll talk about the complexity of the build in just a little while, but just know that this is a DIY amp. It is also a little bit difficult to build, but not too bad if you've got basic soldering skills and patience to read manuals. Moving on with my thanks, the next company I need to thank is the Valve Store. They're a Melbourne-based tube store, and they were kind enough when I told them what I was trying to do to help me out with a little discount on the price of a set of Genelex Gold Line KT88s and 12AU7s. I'll talk a bit later about why I was so keen to get those with the TU-8200R, but I really appreciate the help, so thank you to the Valve Store. Next up we've got Indie Hi-Fi. That's another Australian retailer who sells a range of high-end tube amps and the associated tubes, including Sophia electric tubes. Hugo from Indie Hi-Fi has been kind enough to lend me two sets of tubes, being a set of Sophia Electric KT88s and a set of Sophia Electric EL34s, both of which I've tried with the TU-8200R and both of which I will talk about in a later section of this review. The final thanks I need to make is to the team over at Bottlehead on the Bottlehead forum. Now that may sound strange when I'm talking about an Elekit DIY kit, but the guys over at the Bottlehead forum have been fantastic about answering some of my technical questions about modifications I wanted to make. Of course, they couldn't talk about the specific design of the 8200R, but they could help me talk through and think through some of the things I wanted to do from a general design and technicalities point of view. They've been absolutely invaluable. They have no need to help me other than the fact that they're extremely generous and extremely helpful people. So thank you to the team over at Bottlehead. I think I said that was the final thanks, but I do have one more, and that is channel patron Barbs. Now, not only has Barbs recently lent me things such as the Dan Clark Audio Eon 2 Closed and previously a pair of his ZMF headphones, but he's also helped me talk through and brainstorm some of the modification ideas that we've applied to the TU-8200R. Barbs has also ordered his own. He's going to be building it very soon. He's waiting for one more part to come in, which I'll talk about in part 2 of this review, but he's been really helpful at first of all introducing me to the amp, talking it through with me, and then also talking through mods. As you'll hear in the review, there was a lot to talk about. So without any further ado, let's get into talking about the TU-8200R, starting off with a bit of a close look at the finished product.
Love interrupted by tragedy, lost in the drought of nightfall, running in search of trying to find her place in it all, focused only on the negative. All she can attract is pain. Perception is what will manifest. Thought she could escape.
The Elekit TU-8200R is an $895 do-it-yourself kit tube amp. This is a pure tube amp, it's not a hybrid, it's all tubes. It's designed kind of as a speaker amp. I think ultimately it does have a headphone output, and it's often talked about in glowing terms as a headphone amplifier, but as you'll hear me talk about, I think you need to take some of that talk with a little bit of a grain of salt, but we'll get to that soon. For those of you watching in Australia, that $895 turns into about 1,500 Australian dollars, making it an upper end but not a crazy high end price for a good quality tube amp. I've already alluded to the fact that this is a very large review, and as I said, I am going to split it into two parts. So to give you a good sense of what each part contains, this first part of the video is going to talk about the build process for the 8200R, what it's like to live with day to day as an amplifier. I'm going to talk about a couple of the issues such as the output impedance of the headphone socket, what the general sound quality is like, and a little tiny bit I'm going to touch on some of the modifications and the different tubes that I've played with. But part two of the review is going to go much deeper into the modifications that I think are worth doing to the 8200R, as well as a lot more about the tube rolling and the opportunities to drive different headphones such as some low efficiency planers. I will touch on low efficiency planers in this review, but I'll go into it in much more detail in part two. So if you want to know all about the 8200R, the tube rolling, the modifications, all of that, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now and ring the bell, because the next part is going to take me a little bit of time to produce, but it's not too far down the track. Also, of course, if you find yourself enjoying this video as you watch the rest of it, I'd love it if you'd also hit the like button. It really helps the channel and helps this content to get in front of more people like you. And I nearly forgot to celebrate this massive monster review of the 8200R build and modification process, and of course the sound quality. I'm giving away a pair of Palmu Quiet Mini IEMs. This is also thanks to the people at Palmu for making this unit available as a giveaway. It's a brand new, fully wrapped unit, and if you've watched my recent True Wireless earphone roundup, you'll know that these are my second favourite IEM behind the much more expensive Samsung Galaxy Pro earbuds. So if you'd like to be in the running to win the Palmu Quiet Minis, you need to watch part two of this review, and so that's another reason why I do recommend you hit the subscribe button and ring the bell to make sure you don't miss out. For now though, let's talk about the build of the TU-8200R. When you receive the 8200R in its box, what you're actually getting is a whole lot of different pieces. You're going to get three large pieces wrapped in cardboard and bubble wrap. That's the output transformers and the main power transformer, but then everything else is little in the sense that it's PCB boards, although they're actually not little, they come in slabs that you then have to break up. That's a whole other story, we'll get to that. You've got to break those up into pieces, and then obviously you're going to assemble those later, but everything else is components. So you're getting bags of resistors, capacitors, there's a couple of transistors, diodes, all the different bits and pieces that go to make up a finished product like this, but it's all loose individual pieces. So this is a true DIY kit. Nothing is done for you in advance. You are soldering every bit of componentry for the 8200R into the PCBs. You also, of course, get the case, which comes in three pieces. It just all screws together at the end. Very, very simple. I'll show you some bits and pieces of footage on screen as I move through the description of this process, but there wasn't a huge amount to show you. It's really just a sometimes tedious process of taking individual components, mounting them on the board, and then soldering them on. Having also built some of the bottlehead kits like the crack, the sex, and the mainline, the sex being the single-ended experimenter kit or S.E.X. Having built those, I'd have to say that to me the PCB style soldering and building process of the 8200R is a little bit tedious. All it really feels like you're doing is assembling the kit, not kind of building it, if that makes sense. With the crack, the SEX, and the mainline, I always got to the end feeling like I'd really built the amp, and that's largely because that was point-to-point soldering. What that means is that each piece you were taking a wire to connect it to the next thing, and so whilst there was a frame of sorts in place to allow you to do all those connections, you made every connection yourself. Whereas with this one, what you're doing is you're taking a resistor or a capacitor, whatever the component might be, you're putting each end of the pins of that device through a set of holes predefined with numbering and everything on the board, and then just soldering it in place. So it's kind of more like a join the dots construction rather than feeling like you're actually building it from scratch. Now, for some people, that's not really going to make any difference. For me, it did take a little bit of the fun away, but as you'll hear me talk about shortly, I do still think it's a really worthwhile kit, and in some ways, I think that makes it just a little bit easier to get it right first time. The fact that every space for every component is clearly numbered on the PCB makes it really hard to go wrong, so long as you take your time, you read the instructions, you double check how you're orienting the component before it goes through the board, and then you solder it properly. If you do those things correctly, you really, truly can't go wrong. When you get to the end of all that soldering and assembly, all you do then is plug a bunch of boards together that all fit together using various multi-pin connectors, and then also run a couple of leads from the transformers, both the power and the output transformers, into connectors that just clip into place, and those are things that you've soldered onto the boards as well. So everything's really, really foolproof. And from one point of view, I really love that it's foolproof. As I've said, from another point of view, it does take away the sense that you're building it so much as just assembling it and joining the dots. One thing that I do think is worth mentioning here is the process of breaking apart the PCBs was pretty nasty the first time you do it. I've never had to break a PCB before, and I have to admit I didn't like the feel of it, and I liked the sound of it even less. It's not a bad thing, they're designed to break in the way that they are, but I just didn't like the feel of it, it felt horrible to me. So ideally I would have liked to receive each of the pieces separately, but I understand from an economics point of view, it would be much cheaper for them to produce the PCB boards in one chunk like they do, and have us break them apart as part of the build process. So that's not a reason not to buy this kit, it's just an interesting detail that I thought I'd share. One other thing that I think is really important to share is that you do need to have some soldering skills for this kit. All of the soldering joints are pretty straightforward and pretty basic for the most part. There are a few that take a bit of extra solder where it does take enough time to get a bit of heat into the actual contact before the solder flows, so it's worth having good solder and it's worth knowing what you're doing with a soldering iron. Beyond that, it's not high difficulty soldering for the most part, you just need to understand how soldering works in terms of where and how much heat to apply and then how to feed the solder in. If you've got a general sense of that, you're going to be fine. One of the particularly interesting connections you have to make is at one point you're joining the RCA input board into the main PCB. When you make that join, you're actually making connections with solder. So you're actually making little bridges deliberately between solder pads using solder. It's an unusual technique. It took me off guard when I had to do it, and I originally didn't like the idea, but once I adapted to it, got the sense of how to make the solder flow effectively across the two pads, it was totally fine. But it was very unusual, and I think if you're a beginner solderer, you might struggle working out how to do that step. The manual provided by Tube Sound Audio has been fully translated to English. It's very, very simple and straightforward to follow, but it doesn't really provide any tips on how to do the soldering, and that's why I say it's worth knowing how to solder up front. As I understand it, the Japanese manual that comes from Elekit also doesn't cover that sort of stuff, so you should know what you're doing with a soldering iron before you begin. The total build process for me was broken up across a couple of nights. It's probably a grand total of 4 to 5 hours if you had the ability just to focus consistently on it. Because I've got a nearly 1-year-old in the room next door and working a separate paid job as well as the channel, my time was a little bit broken up, so I didn't produce it quite as fast as some people might, but I think 4 to 5 hours of dedicated time is a fair and reasonable estimate. So it's not a crazy difficult kit. I do think my bottlehead mainline probably took me about half as much again, maybe twice as much time to build, so probably closer to 8 hours in total, but at the same time, it's also point to point, so you are making more connections. I would describe the process of building a bottlehead kit more fun, but they're also probably more time consuming. The 8200R is less fun, but you will get it done quicker. One little thing that did slow me down with the Elekit, and something I probably should have mentioned sooner, was that sometimes finding where the components went on the PCB was a little bit tricky. The numbering didn't always make sense if you didn't necessarily understand the circuit, which I didn't, so I was able to look at the circuit diagram and get a rough sense of things, but I'm not well versed in reading circuit diagrams and circuit designs, so the numbering system to me didn't always add up. Sometimes you'd be down in the bottom left-hand corner for number 34, and then you'd be all the way up in the top right-hand corner for number 35. So I did lose some time sometimes looking around the circuit board 2 and 3 times trying to scan through and find where a particular component goes. It only happened a couple of times, but it was a little bit frustrating when it happened if you're trying to get through the kit relatively quickly. So to this point, let's sum things up. If you're interested in doing some DIY work, you've got basic soldering skills, and you're not necessarily looking for a super fun build so much as just a build that you know you've done yourself, and at the end of it, you'll have enough understanding that you might be able to tweak it should you want to, then the 8200R is a great choice. By putting aside 4 to 5 dedicated hours broken up altogether however you want to do it, by putting aside that time, you'll have yourself a beautiful amplifier at the end. Now I say beautiful because I think it looks quite good. When you see it in part 2, it might look a little bit different if I've had my way by then, but I think it does look great in its stock version. It's also beautiful in how it sounds, as I'll describe shortly. Before I talk about sound quality though, let's get acquainted with what you get once it's all built, and then I'll talk about a few little bits and pieces of quirks that I found as I've lived with the 8200R for quite a few weeks now. Let's start with the front panel. So along the front panel, we've got a power switch over here. We've got an LED that you can choose the color of. So it's a multicolor LED with a jumper switch. You can have it green, which is what I've chosen. You can have it blue, or you can have it red. So you can match it to the color scheme of the rest of your gear. You can choose the color that you find most relaxing and enjoyable to see, whatever you like. Moving on from the power switch, we've then got the headphone output socket. It's a 6.3mm jack, and I'm going to come back and talk about that more in a minute. You've got the volume control. It's a really nice feeling volume control. I have read about people changing the volume control in this. I don't feel any need to. Having done a couple of mods, I think the volume control is just fine for the level of amp this is, and it feels good, it fits well, it keeps everything simple. So I like the volume control. I also like the design of the knob they've chosen. Moving on, we've then got the input selector switch. So you've got two RCA inputs, as you'll see in a moment, so you can flick between those two. Ignore this one for now. That's a modification that I've made. It's a secondary 6.3mm socket, and I'll explain that all in part 2, but I'll give you a quick hint of it towards the end of part 1 here. On top of the amp here, we've got the power tubes, and we've got a pair of input tubes. In terms of inputs, this uses 12AU7 tubes. These are also known as ECC82 tubes, but that's about where the options end. This is not a highly rollable socket, if you want to call it that. You can use all the different 12AU7 tubes on the market, of which there are many, 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 but it's not like it's a socket where you should be rolling lots of different potential preamp tubes through. On the other hand, the power tube sockets give you heaps of opportunities. Whilst it comes stock with a set of 6L6GC tubes, you can also roll through KT88s, KT77s, KT66s, EL34s, 6P3S, and I think that's about it. But as you can tell from that list, there are lots of different choices you can try, and the very best thing about the 8200R is its self-biasing. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with tube amps, what that means is that with different tubes, the amount of voltage required into the tube to maximize its performance is variable. As tubes age, and even as they're brand new, the amounts of voltage required to get the same output will vary slightly. On an amp like the mainline under my desk here, I have to go in there and adjust a little dial with a voltmeter attached in order to bias the tubes correctly. The other option in some other amps is you have to buy matched tubes that will perform at exactly the same level given the same voltage input. In the case of the 8200R, it has a system that does that for you. So you can take any of those tubes I spoke about then, you can take unmatched pairs if you want to, you can put them in and the amp will take care of the rest. It's going to measure the voltage differences between the two tubes and adjust accordingly to make sure they output the same. It's a great system, and it means you're not tied into buying expensive matched pairs. You can pick up one tube here, one tube there, plug them both in, and away you go. I think you should generally stick with the same model and manufacturer for the pair of tubes, but the key is you don't have to make sure they're matched. Now, while we're talking tubes, let's talk quickly about heat. The power tubes used by the 8200R do generate a lot of heat. The 12AU7s not so much, but these guys definitely do, particularly if you go to something like a KT88 that puts out a lot of heat. So this area of the amp is going to get very, very hot during use. Nothing you should be worried about other than burning if you touch them, of course. Nothing that's dangerous from an operational point of view of the amp, but it is worth knowing that the general vicinity will be warm, and if you touch them, they will burn you when it's on, and for a little while after it's off as well. So do be careful with that. Having covered off the tubes, let's now take a look at the back. Now this amp has got a bit of weight to it, as you might be able to tell from how I'm lifting it, and that's because there is a huge power transformer in the middle here and a couple of output transformers on each side. I'll talk about those a lot more when it comes to part 2, because one of the things I'm going to be doing is swapping out the output transformers. For now though, let's talk about the back panel here. Up the top, there are actually holes here available where you can buy an onboard DAC that will go into the slot there, and behind this sticker, there are holes for access to things like USB sockets and the like. I haven't tried the DAC, I don't intend to try the DAC, so I can't review it here, but it is an option. Below the DAC section, we have a number of input options. We've got the two pairs of RCAs that I spoke about before, input 1, input 2, and then we've also got a 3.5mm input. Now the 3.5mm input is part of input 2, and so when you switch to input 2, the amplifier will either take the RCAs if there's nothing else plugged into the 3.5, or it will prioritise the 3.5mm if you have anything plugged in there. So just to make that clear, if you have something plugged into all three sockets and you switch to input 2, you're going to hear the 3.5mm. You'd have to unplug that in order to hear what's plugged into the RCA. I haven't used the 3.5mm, I don't really have any use to, so for now I've just used the RCA sockets. Moving down the panel a bit, we've got two sets of binding posts that are designed for speaker terminations, so this is a speaker amp, probably first and foremost with a headphone output as a secondary option. I haven't tested this as a speaker amp, I didn't buy it as a speaker amp because I don't use passive speakers. So this review won't cover that. I'm sorry if you were looking for that, but I'm not equipped to do it. I actually don't own any passive speakers. In between these binding posts, we've got a switch where you can choose the impedance of your speakers, either 4 to 6 ohms or 8 to 16 ohms. What that's going to do is use a different winding of the output transformers to provide more power to higher impedance speakers. It does also mean a higher noise floor, and so I've left it on the 4 ohm setting because that requires less power and therefore should help reduce any hum that you get through the headphone sockets. But again, we'll talk about that in just a moment. I don't mean to keep teasing that, there's just a lot to cover here. The final thing on the back panel, very simple, it's a standard IEC power socket, so just for a normal everyday power cord. So that's all there is to the outside of the 8200R. So having turned it back around now, I want to talk about two things and then I promise we will get to sound quality. The first thing I want to talk about is that when you have this running at higher volumes, you may hear sound even if you have nothing plugged into it. And it's really weird, but it's a thing that's sometimes referred to as singing transformers. The output transformers on the 8200R actually vibrate with the sound coming through them and produce a sound like a really poor quality tiny speaker. But it means you can hear your music even with nothing plugged in. It can be a little bit off-putting, but it's not doing any damage and it is a known phenomena, so don't worry about that if you happen to hear it. Now the one final thing I'm going to mention, and this starts to cross into sound quality now, is this headphone output socket. Now as you'd expect here on the channel where I don't talk about passive speakers, all of my sound quality impressions of the TU-8200R are in relation to headphones. And so with that in mind, it's very important to know how this headphone socket works. Basically what's going on inside the 8200R is there's a connection from the speaker outputs all the way through the amp into the headphone socket. But it passes through a couple of fancy little designs along the way where you can use jumper switches to reduce the volume output. That's really helpful on one hand because the full power output from the speaker taps on the back would be too much for most headphones and you'd risk blowing them up. The problem is the way it's been implemented means the output impedance of this headphone socket is in excess of 230 ohms, which is absolutely ridiculous if you're using anything less than a 300 ohm headphone. In this day and age, where the majority of headphones on the market are below 100 ohms, or at least below 200, it just seems a bit crazy to me that you design an amplifier like this that has a 200 plus ohm output. It's a very old-fashioned way of designing things and it just doesn't stack up anymore. I'm not an electrical engineer, so when I say it doesn't make sense and it's crazy, I don't mean from a design point of view, I mean from a marketing point of view. This is an amplifier that does not make sense for most people with headphone listening in mind. It doesn't make sense for them to buy this amplifier in its stock form. As I'll talk about shortly, you can do magical things with headphones with this amplifier with fairly minor modifications, but you do need to modify it if you want it to perform properly. So I mean no offense to the designers of this, and I don't for a second suggest that I could do a better job because I couldn't even begin to design an amplifier like this. What I do know though is that this headphone socket in its stock form is really not going to be useful for the majority of people looking at buying this amp for headphone usage. If you're buying it predominantly for speakers and headphones are a secondary thing, it's great. Absolutely fantastic, no issues at all. But if you're like me and you're buying it as a headphone amp, then you're going to want to make modifications, and it would be great to see a revision of this that applies some of the sorts of things. I'm not saying what I'm going to suggest that I've done is exactly the right thing to do, but some of the sorts of concepts that I've applied would be great to see applied by the designers and probably improved on because they're going to know even more about what they're doing. If you're sitting there wondering what the fuss is about with this output impedance thing and why I'm making a big deal about it, let me show you a couple of graphs on screen and I'll just scroll through them as I keep talking. These graphs are showing you what happens when you drive a headphone with a high output impedance. Now this doesn't apply to planar magnetic headphones, it only applies to dynamic headphones where the impedance of the driver will vary with the movement of the driver, so with the frequency basically. So because the impedance of the driver changes depending on the frequency of the music being presented to it, or the signal being presented to it, what happens is that it produces more or less sound at different frequencies depending on the output impedance. If that sounded like gobbledygook, don't worry, it didn't make sense to me at first either. Let me put it in really simple terms. Just about every dynamic driver on the market has a variable impedance. So whilst you might see on the box it says it's an 80 ohm headphone, the reality is its impedance changes from maybe 80 ohms at 20 Hz, it might be 80 ohms at 500 Hz, but in between it might jump up to 130 ohms, and then higher up in the range, maybe it drops down to 60 ohms. So it's actually all over the place. What that means is that the headphone amplifier has to output consistent voltage or power to that headphone regardless of those changes in impedance. A very low output impedance makes it more possible for the amplifier to do that. A high output impedance makes it much more difficult for the amplifier to do that. And so the result you get, as you're seeing on screen right now, is that with high output impedance, you'll get peaks in the output in certain locations. So as you're seeing on screen, in some cases when I'm using different headphones with the low and the high output impedance setup that I've got here, the high output impedance is causing massive variations in the sound and the sound signature of the particular headphones. So that's really not ideal if you've bought headphones that you like as the way they sound on a normal headphone amplifier, and you plug them into this and suddenly you're getting a big boost in the mid bass, or maybe it's going down into the sub bass, maybe it's affecting the treble. It can actually affect all different areas potentially. If you're having that effect on the headphones, you may end up with something you like more, but often you're going to end up with something you like less, and that's a real disappointment. The other thing that these graphs don't necessarily take into account is the fact that the high output impedance also changes the amp's ability to damp the speaker. Now what that means is that an amplifier is responsible for both pushing the driver, but also stopping the driver. And as you raise the output impedance, you reduce the amp's ability to effectively stop the driver. The end result of that is a looser, flabbier sound in some cases. It will generally make most headphones sound a bit warmer, and it can also reduce resolution and detail. Because when the headphone is required to do very subtle changes in motion, it needs to be stopped and started or changed direction very quickly, and the amplifier can't do that if it's got a high output impedance. So by now you're probably understanding why I think this is a very poor design for a headphone amplifier to have a 230 ohm plus output. One final issue with it that I should mention is that it also makes it very difficult for the amplifier to deliver power to low impedance loads. If you're trying to run a somewhat difficult planar magnetic headphone off the output that's stock on the 8200, you're going to run out of juice a lot of times. So for instance, with the Aeon 2 closed that Paul, also known as Barbs, lent me a little while ago, I was having to really crank the volume on the 8200R to get anywhere near enough juice out of it. That can also mean you're ending up with lots of distortion because the amp may not have the juice to give you enough output to handle all the frequencies properly. So it's really not an ideal setup at all in its stock form, particularly if you're running low impedance, low sensitivity planar magnetics, but also if you want to have a true, accurate representation of the sound from any headphone under say 300 ohms. It's an old-fashioned design that's suited for high impedance headphones only, and there's just not enough of those around anymore for this to make sense to me. But don't despair at this point, don't switch off the video. There is lots you can do, and it's not too hard in order to get amazing sound out of the 8200R. And that's why I've broken this into two videos. So let's talk now about sound quality, and I'm going to talk in general terms, recognizing that things can get even better than what I'm about to say with a few simple mods. For testing of the sound quality, I used a bunch of different headphones, things like the Mesa Empyreans, which whilst a low impedance planar magnetic, they're not too hard to drive. I also used the Sennheiser HD 560S that I reviewed recently. I tried the Aeon 2 closed, which didn't go so well. I've used the Focal Utopias, AKG K712s, all sorts of different headphones to get a general sense of the sound from the 8200R. And overall, I'd say its sound didn't blow me away in the stock setup. Now, a big part of that is going to be the output from the headphone socket here being such high output impedance. That is going to reduce transparency due to the damping I spoke about before and change the overall tonality of many of the headphones I tried. It sounded good, so don't get me wrong, it didn't sound bad, but it didn't sound amazing. Given the pricing of this sits somewhere between the Bottlehead SEX, the single-ended experimenter kit, and the mainline, I was expecting performance similar. And I don't think in its stock form it quite matches the Bottlehead SEX. With some modifications, it far outperforms it, but in stock form, I do think it fell just a tiny bit short perhaps, or at least was on par, but was not as much fun to build and cost a bit more money. Some of the things that it did do well though, is it provided a really nice soundstage, not amazing, but really nice, and a nice, rich, smooth sound. I think part of that, which I'll talk about in part 2, is the resistor network used to tame the output from the headphone socket that you might be hearing, just providing a bit of extra warmth and a little tiny loss of resolution through the headphone socket. When you move over to taking an output from the speaker taps in a safe way, which I'll talk about, when you do that, it actually opens the amplifier up quite a great deal, and so I think those resistors are limiting the sound. If you want a rich, thicker sound, what some people think of as tubey, then that's probably going to be fine coming out of that socket. But if you actually want a transparent and resolving amp, I believe you need to bypass that, and I'll talk about that shortly. So overall, in its stock form, I would say that the 8200R is probably much more of a speaker amp than it is a headphone amp. I think you shouldn't buy it and expect to not make any modifications if you're looking for a headphone amp. If you're happy to dedicate it only to 300 ohm plus headphones like the ZMFs, the Sennheisers, and some Beodynamics, then maybe it does make sense. It performs really nicely with my Beodynamic DT-8200 ohms, and it does do really nicely with low impedance planar magnetics that are easier to drive because they're not affected by output impedance. But overall, I don't think in its very, very stock form, it's an amplifier that I would absolutely recommend. However, if you're up to the task of building this, you're probably up to the task of making some minor modifications, and that's where things get really, really interesting. So to finish off part 1 of this review, I want to talk about 2 things that I'm going to expand on a great deal more in part 2. I want to talk about some of the tube rolling options, and I want to talk about the modifications that I've made. Let's start talking about some of the mods. So one of the modifications I made is there are a few capacitors in here that you can change out, and it does, in my opinion, improve the transparency and resolution by just a little bit. It's not something I would rush to do, but if you can be bothered doing it, and as I'll show you in some pictures on screen, if you're happy to have it look a bit messy as a result, because you've got to do things a bit strangely to fit them all in, but if you're happy to fiddle around, happy to make things a bit ugly, you can get a slight but noticeable improvement in resolution and detail. I'll talk a lot more about what those mods are in part 2, but I wanted to share them with you now so you know where this is headed. The other modification that I think is really necessary for headphone amp use is this socket here. Now the good news is you don't have to drill holes in the metal like I have and embed this in the actual amplifier. You can easily do it in an external box or just a fly lead running from the speaker taps. What I've got going on inside here and what I built as an external box for channel patron Paul is basically a little resistor network that reduces the output voltage from the speaker taps without increasing the impedance. So instead of having this 230 ohm output impedance, there's an output impedance I think of around 1 ohm I measured in the end, and it produces a sound that has usable volume range, much greater transparency than what's built in here, and allows you to use any headphone under the sun. Now the only thing I haven't tested at the time of this recording is a really difficult planar magnetic, but hopefully by the time I do part 2, I can give you some information on that. What I can tell you is that this modification here transforms the 8200R from a mediocre, decent sounding headphone amp that's a little bit too rich and smooth for my tastes, to a headphone amp that is absolutely wonderful, particularly for the price. You're adding a little bit of extra money in order to make that modification, be it as an external or an internal. You're probably spending, and I'll tell you more in part 2, but to estimate it off the top of my head now, you're probably spending in the vicinity of $60 to $100 more, and that's Australian dollars, so call it say 40 to 60 US dollars, and you've got yourself an amazing, amazing setup. It's also not overly difficult to build it into the amp, but it is a little bit ugly, as I'll show you in part 2. So with all that in mind, you can absolutely turn the TU-8200R into a headphone amplifier beast. Add to that the fact that you can roll so many different tubes through this, you can get lots of different sound characteristics out of a single amp, and it's got lots and lots of power, so you can drive lots and lots of different devices. So from that point of view, I think the TU-8200 is a winner so long as you're willing to make a few mods. And I'm very happy to detail all of those modifications, including a full description of how I made them, in part 2 of this video. So do make sure you subscribe and ring the bell if you're interested in that. The final thing I want to talk about before we wrap things up is just to give you a taste of some of the different tube rolling options that are available from the 8200R and the sorts of sounds you can expect. I won't go into detail here about the 12AU7s because they're all 12AU7s, so the differences are fairly subtle. I will go through them in part 2 though. What I wanted to talk about, just to give you a sense of whether you want to continue on this journey with me in part 2, I wanted to talk briefly about the different characteristics of some of the tubes I've tried in the power tube slot. The 6L6GC hasn't really blown me away with what I've tried so far. They're fine, they're nice, but they're not amazing. The ones that have really caught my attention have been the EL34s. They just help to give the sound a bit of extra weight in the mid-range and bring the sound from the 8200R much more comparable to my kind of reference point for tube amps, which is the bottlehead mainline. The 8200R doesn't quite match the mainline in all areas, but at the same time, it might do a few things better than the mainline in others. So whilst the 6L6GC hasn't been my favourite tube, the EL34 I think is fantastic. I also have really liked what I've heard from the KT88s, and whilst they're not what I would choose to ultimately stick with, they bring a really interesting, detailed, fast and clean sound to the amp without losing the benefits of the smoothness and the richness that you expect from a tube amp. Now I know I keep saying this on the channel, but you never know which people are watching which reviews, so I do like to keep saying it to try to kill this myth. Not all tube amps sound thick and rich and slow. The 8200R is a great example, particularly once you do the mods that I've just spoken about. It's a great example of a very transparent, very fast, very clean tube amp, in much the same way as the mainline is. There are certainly tube amps like the recently reviewed Dark Voice that do make things a bit richer and thicker and creamier, but this is not necessarily one of them. The good news is you can head in that direction if you want to with some of the 6L6GC varieties and indeed with some of the EL34 varieties. But at the same time, you can swing back in the other direction with something like the KT88. I've tried the Genelex Goldline KT88s and also Sophia Electric KT88s, and in both cases they were fantastic. The Sophia Electrics in particular were outstanding with their detail retrieval and their transparency. So I'll talk a lot more about all these different variations and the modifications in part 2, but I wanted to talk about the fact that the 8200R has the ability to be, I think, the perfect tube amp for just about anybody. You can thicken it up if you want to with certain tubes, or you can get it faster and more resolving with something like the KT88s. If you're more like me and you want to go somewhere in the middle, there's some great EL34 options and probably some 6L6GC options that I just haven't had a chance to try yet. So if you're in the market for a DIY project or a tube amp or both, you've got some basic soldering skills, you've got patience, and you're willing to spend 4 to 5 hours plus some extra time and hassle building up the mods that I'm going to talk about in part 2, then the TU-8200R is absolutely an amp you should think about. Of course, if you've only got 300 plus ohm headphones, it's also a headphone amp you could buy and use quite happily with no modifications at all. But if you want the versatility, variety, and transparency that I've described towards the end of this review, then you're definitely going to want to watch part 2, and you're definitely going to want to keep the 8200R on your radar. I want to say a huge thanks again to Tube Sound Audio Australia. Anyone that's watched this review from Australia that likes the sound of what I'm talking about, but at the same time is a bit overawed by the idea of a DIY project, do remember that they offer Amp Camp, and it's something that you could choose to do if you want to get these results without necessarily having to do it all on your own. I can't suggest for a second that Stephen's going to support you to do some of the modifications that I've made, but I'll absolutely share those modifications in part 2 of this, and I've already spoken to Stephen about sharing them with him so that he might be able to put together a product or a kit to support people that want to do what I've done, and also what channel patron Paul has done in order to get the most out of the headphone capabilities of the 8200R. To be really clear, there's no kickbacks involved in any of this review. It's all just a matter, in my case, of saying thanks to the various companies that have helped me to make this massive review possible. It's been a bit of a labour of love, as I said. It's taken ages to put together, but I've really wanted to share it all with you because I think it's interesting, and I hope you have too. If you've enjoyed this, I'd love it if you'd let me know down in the comments, hit the like button, and of course hit subscribe if you haven't already. Do stay tuned for part 2 of the review, and remember that the giveaway of the Palmo Quiet Mini will happen as a result of that review. I'll give you all the details there. For now though, I'll leave you to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.